Welcome to the ANRCB project's module on introductory concepts in nutrition. In this video, we will discuss food security and food systems. By the end of this topic, we hope that you will be able to explain the relationship between food security and nutrition, to have a conceptual understanding of food systems, to be able to outline the key components of food systems, to identify the links between food safety and nutrition. So to start here, the discussion around food security is based on the idea of food as a fundamental right for all people. The definition of food security is what you see on the right here. Food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Although this definition is relatively short, it contains a lot of ideas. So let's discuss the various dimensions that are encompassed in this definition. So traditionally, when we discuss food security, we talk about the first three items in this table: availability, access, and utilization. Availability is simply whether foods are available in your environment. So in your local market, are foods there or are they not? That's availability. Access is whether you are able to reach those foods. So for example, if I live very close to a market, but the food is very expensive, and for me it's not affordable, then I do not have economic access to that food. Another example would be physical access. So if a market is very far from my home, and I don't have a method of transportation, perhaps there is no bus that will take me there, I don't have a car or a bicycle, then I don't have physical access. So even though the food is available in the market, for me, I am not able to access it. Utilization, then the third item here, has to do with cooking and eating food in your home. So that is how you use the food. Now there are some other dimensions in addition to these. So stability it has to do with kind of short-term availability and access. So for example, we know that over the short term, certain foods are seasonal. There are sometimes to have fruits, and sometimes when fruits are less common. There are vegetables that we might have when there is more rain. Even the production of milk by animals changes over time. And so the idea of stability is to always have food that is available, that you have access, that you can utilize over time, over the calendar year. This is in contrast to sustainability, which is a much more long-term idea. There we're talking about the natural resources that are available to us and to the planet, so that in the present day onto future generations, we're able to have food security. That's the idea of sustainability. Agency has to do with people having the ability to make choices about what they eat, that they can choose what they prefer, what they individually like, what is common for their culture, and so on. So that having those choices is what agency is. So really that previous definition that we saw here in this slide really encompasses all of these ideas, that all people can have food security. And ultimately, that is based on our idea or a belief that people have a right to food to meet their basic needs. And also this helps us then to achieve that key sustainable development goal number 2 of having zero hunger. So having defined that, then what is a food system? A food system is everything that produces and brings foods to our table. So that includes farmers, processes, people, the environment, all of these elements and activities that have to do with producing food, processing, distributing it, preparing it, and ultimately eating it, and then the outcomes of these activities as well. So there's really three constituent elements that I'll discuss in some detail, and those are the food supply chains, food environments, and consumer behavior. And what I would like you to think about as we discuss all of these various elements is, what are the opportunities to bring nutrition into these elements, and where might we lose nutrition as we move through the food system? So here is a food systems framework. This is a conceptual framework for a food system, and there's truly a lot in this diagram. We'll discuss its various component parts. So let me get a pointer so I can talk with you. So the food system is everything in this large yellow box. That includes production systems all the way to markets, to retail, the environment in which we interact with our foods. There's a lot of factors here that then drive our behavior as consumers of food, that shape our diets, both in the quantity and the quality of our foods, as well as the safety of those foods. These ultimately determine our nutrition and health, as well as have broader impacts for society and for the environment. Now, there are many drivers, and we'll talk through several of these. These could be environmental drivers, demographic, political, even drivers that can affect the food system in various ways. There's also policies and governance that will affect the food system. And underneath all of this is our concepts of both food security and the right to food for all people. So when we think about what we need in terms of food systems, to really achieve food security, we want food systems that are productive so that we have sufficient availability of food. We want them to be equitable and inclusive so that all people have that same access to food. We want food systems to be respectful and empowering so that people are able to make choices according to their preferences, individually and culturally, and so that they have a voice in determining how their food systems function. We want them to be resilient so that when there are shocks, sudden changes in food prices, when there's conflict, when there is a pandemic, that there is stability over time. We want it to be regenerative so that we have sustainability in the longer term across generations. And we, of course, want it to be healthy and nutritious so that we can have good nutrients and good utilization of food. So let's start at the beginning of the food chain, which is, or the food systems, which is the food supply chains. The food supply chains include all the people and activities that take us from the production of food to consumption. So this includes farmers and other kinds of production systems, but it's not just farms. So for example, it's not just growing vegetables and grain and so on. It's not crops only. It can also be animals. It can be trees that can provide food, such as nuts and fruits. It can be fisheries, whether those are wild or whether those are fish farming. There can be inputs that are brought in. So for example, fertilizer, the labor, perhaps you have people who are hired to work on the farm. It can be excuse me, it can be banks, for example, that provide loans to farmers to allow them to grow crops. So there are really many issues around production. And then as we move to after harvest, we have issues around storage and distribution. There are different people who might be engaged in those activities. So people who transport food and distribute them to farther places. There is aspects of food science, so processing and packaging of food, whether that's through industry, through small enterprises, or any other kinds of actors. And then finally, food reaches markets. So those could be people who sell food. Those could be people in restaurants or grocery stores, any place where we can buy food. Some of these are going to be very formal, such as a restaurant, and some are more informal. For example, people who sell food on the street. Now, the next step here is the food environment. The food environment is everything around us in which people interface and acquire food. So that could be the physical environment, the economic, the cultural environment, all of those places where we come in contact with food. So that includes food entry points. Those are things like stores and shops and restaurants. Those are those physical places. It could be the infrastructure around those places that allows us to access foods, which those could involve markets, those could involve even roads. And then there are personal aspects. So the things that you individually like to eat, the values, the traditions that you have within your own family, your income that affects your access to food. Then there's larger societal forces as well, right? Traditions, religion, and so on. So let's talk a little bit more about what these elements are. We talked about food availability and physical access. So that is being close and being able to reach markets and other sources of food. We talked about economic access, which is around affordability. Certain foods may or may not be considered acceptable. This can be quite cultural, where some foods in certain cultures are very preferred, but are not preferred or even considered acceptable in other cultures. That's very common. There's also a large information environment that we all live in. So there might be food-based guidelines for good nutrition. There can be promotion that happens through the health system or with health workers or through media. There can be advertising and marketing from the food industry that encourages us to purchase certain goods. So a lot of information. And then there's issues around and mechanisms to ensure food quality and safety as well. Finally, we also have policies that are in place to address all of the above. So a little bit more about access. Again, mobility has to do with distance to food and where food is acquired and the method of transportation. Other aspects of access that you may not immediately think of have to do with health and physical and other disability. So those can limit your ability to reach certain kinds of foods, to acquire them, to have the income to acquire them as well. There's purchasing power, so how much money and ability that you have to have economic access. There's also some very basic needs. So for example, your access to a good kitchen, to have the necessary materials for cooking, your access to fuel for cooking, and then the availability of time for preparing the foods that you desire. And then finally, we can also think about knowledge and skills to prepare and to use foods. thinking about the diversity of foods that are preferred, that might be traditional. These all require different knowledge and skills to prepare. So then moving on to consumer behavior, by this I mean we're talking about all those choices and decisions that we make, either as individuals or as households, around what foods to acquire, do we store, prepare, how do we eat them, how do we share them within households and allocate food from the different members within a household. All of this is influenced by personal preferences. So those could be, organoleptic or, taste, and other characteristics of the food itself. It could be the convenience of preparing or eating them. It could be coming from cultures, from the price of foods, from religion, from values and beliefs, and customs. All of these can influence consumer behavior. And then, of course, the food environment itself. The physical nature of the food environment, where things are located, the prices that are involved, are all going to affect consumer behaviors as well. And then finally, there are certain behaviors that are followed when people experience food insecurity. So all of these factors interact with one another to determine the dietary choices that people make, and then ultimately their health and nutrition. So if we go back and we look at the food system, which is what we see here in the middle, that combination or that process that starts with the food supply chain, moves through food environments, and ultimately determines our consumer behavior and our diets. And that leads to our improved nutrition and health. We can now think about that idea of how nutrition enters and exits this system. So we can think of policies and programs, for example, that will bring nutrition into this system. So this can include agricultural extension or health extension. It can be food fortification. It can be support to farmers to grow healthy crops. Things that affect our food environment can involve social marketing or behavior change communication, nutritional guidelines, zoning policies that determine where restaurants can be established or where grocery shops can be established. All of those factors can bring nutrition positively into the system. There are also policies and programs that can take nutrition away. So if there are subsidies, governmental subsidies that support less nutritious foods, there might be other kinds of policies. There could be nutritional guidelines that do not support the health and nutrition evidence. Products in the markets can be misleadingly labeled. There can be advertising of unhealthy foods to all people or to children. Those things can take away nutrition from the food system. So this is a kind of a helpful framework to think about how different interventions, policies, programs can affect the food system and have consequences for health and nutrition. Okay, so now in this this idea of a food system, the food system is actually quite dynamic. It's constantly changing, and there are many drivers that are influencing it in positive and negative ways. So let me just talk very briefly through some of these drivers. So we can think about environmental drivers. These are things like natural resources, the quality of the land, of the soil, the fertility of the soil, water, biodiversity. There are drivers such as climate change that are affecting the food system in many sorts of ways. There are also many new technologies. Some are simple, some are more advanced. We have new varieties of crops, of seeds, new technologies such as mechanization that can improve agriculture. There's also a lot of innovation in terms of food science to process foods in various ways, to preserve them, to extend their shelf life so that they are healthy and safe for longer periods. There's also infrastructure changes that are happening, development of roads that allow movement of food from farms to markets and to people, development of cold chains, refrigeration, so that perishable foods can stay safe and healthy and not spoil. There are other drivers as well. So we can think of a range of political or economic drivers that have to do with governance, to do with taxes, regulations, globalization falls under this. Conflicts and humanitarian crises fall under this category. So really a wide range of very influential factors. There can be cultural drivers as well. So we can think about traditions, religion. We can think about the status of women within a society and their roles in terms of food. Those can all play a role in the food systems. There are also demographic shifts. So we can think about aging populations, urbanization, migration. All of these are also going to affect the food systems in many ways. And as these drivers operate, what we see in many countries throughout the world is a transition that happens as societies develop and change. And these can be driven by economic growth, by urbanization, technology, all of those kinds of drivers that I just discussed. And there's a certain pattern that this follows. So in early times of human history, a lot people relied on hunting and gathering wild foods as a source of their foods. People then moved into crop and animal production. They became agrarian. These times were often challenging. There can be times of famine, depending on the success or failure of crops and livestock and other stressors. As time moves forward and as societies develop, famines become less common. But then we see this emergence of other problems, especially around non-communicable diseases. And we hope for this final stage where we have desired outcomes. So across these 5 stages that I've just outlined, there are changes in both physical activity and eating behavior. So the hunter-gatherer stage uses wild plants and animals as a source of food. As we move on, we have domestication of plants and animals. So we have the emergence of agriculture, but during the early stages of this, diets can often be very focused on carbohydrates. They can have low protein, low fat. And then as food systems develop and mature, we start seeing more processed foods. We start seeing things like sugar-sweetened beverages, and these can lead and increase our risk of non-communicable diseases. And ultimately, what we hope to see, and although not many societies have successfully achieved this yet, what we hope to see is a reduction in some of these processed foods that are high in fat, sugar, and salt, more consumption of things like fruits and vegetables that are more conducive to health. So similarly with this transition, we see a lifestyle that involves a lot of physical labor that ultimately reduces so that people become more sedentary, and that also has consequences for health. So when you put all of these things together in the early stages, we have a transition from a high burden of infectious disease to a greater burden of non-communicable diseases. So it's helpful to think about where societies fall within this nutritional transition. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the specific strategies that we have within food systems to improve nutrition. So one important one is food fortification. So food fortification is a strategy really to address micronutrient deficiencies, and it involves putting one or more macronutrients into foods that are widely consumed. And the idea is to improve the overall nutrition of the food supply. And the goal here is to improve public health without posing any kind of risk to that health. Fortification in societies, they can be voluntary. The people who produce and process foods can choose to fortify and add nutrition or specific nutrients to their products. It can also be mandatory, as in required by law. And some good examples involve addition of iodine to salt, iron and folic acid to flour, a grain flour, vitamin D to milk, and various sorts of micronutrients that can be added to infant cereals. Another important issue in all of this is this idea of food safety. So food safety addresses all those hazards that might make food harmful for our health. And it addresses strategies to reduce contamination within our food. Contamination can occur at all stages of within the food system, from production to contamination that happens on the farm, through processing, through transportation and distribution within markets, and even within households where people are preparing and eating food. So food that is safe would be free of contaminants, that they won't cause illness, they won't cause harm to health. And contamination can be from various sources. So they can be biological, could be bacterial, or other kind of contamination, insects, fungi, mold, and their products. So for example, toxins that come from mold, such as aflatoxins, can have a negative impact on health. It could be physical contamination, so it could be plastics, dirt, dust, and so on. It can be chemical. So for example, substances that come through food processing, agricultural chemicals such as pesticides can also contaminate food. So there's really a wide range. But then there's also that contamination that can happen within the home. And that's a consequence of sanitation within the home, as well as hygienic practices that can ensure food safety at the individual and household levels. So if you recall from earlier module or earlier topics, we talked about this bidirectional link between nutrition and infection. The foods that tend to be more nutritious are actually the same foods that are more susceptible to contamination. So if we think about fruits and vegetables, they can spoil easily. Similarly, animal foods such as meat or milk, they often require refrigeration if they are to be maintained in the long term. The challenge of food safety is not just the harm that contamination can do for human health. It's also that concerns about food safety can discourage people from eating these particularly nutritious foods. So for example, people who are nutritionally vulnerable, think of pregnant women or lactating women or young children. Concerns about food safety for these people who very much need a good nutrition can prevent them from eating exactly those foods that would provide the best nutrition. So food safety really is important, and the linkages between food safety and nutrition are strong. There are some benefits of food processing. So foods that are ultra processed can have this addition of unhealthy ingredients such as salt, sugar, and fat. But food processing can also be positive. It can help ensure food safety. It can reduce contamination. It can increase the shelf stability of food. It can make the nutrients within food more available when they're consumed by the body. Food processing is actually not something that is alone positive or negative for health. It's much more detailed than that. certainly by improving or ensuring food safety, there are some other consequences. So for example, these activities may cost money, which then can translate into higher prices. So that's another challenge, especially when you're dealing with poor or disadvantaged or vulnerable populations, that they might have less access to safe foods. All right, to summarize our discussion here in this topic, food security and nutrition are key for realizing the right to food and to achieving the Sustainable Development Goal of zero hunger. Sustainable food systems are also key then to support and achieve these 6 dimensions that we discussed of food security. Food systems include food supply chains and food environments, which then determine our behavior as consumers, our diets, and are ultimately our nutrition and health. Food systems are constantly changing, and they're driven by many, many factors. These include globalization, urbanization, changes in livelihoods, changes in the roles of women, the climate change, and other things. We're interested for food systems to increase the quantity of food, but we also want to investigate and support strategies to improve diets by improving nutritional quality and food safety. Food safety is very important for good nutrition and health. And we know that as these drivers are acting on food systems and on human populations, there is this transition that's happening in terms of our nutrition, where people on the whole globally are increasingly consuming unhealthy foods. Their physical activity is decreasing, and we're seeing a greater prevalence of non-communicable disease. All right, thank you very much for your attention. This concludes topic 5 of module 1.